Okay, so welcome. We're going to be talking to you about stories of humiliation and the potential of reframing those stories as stories of dignity. We have a wonderful group who pooled ideas to talk about this. What we're going to be able to share in this message to you, the world, is a very small slice or microcosm of the plethora of ideas and observations we shared. The way we decided to do it is that I'm going to be interviewing, I'm Claudia Cohen, I'm going to be interviewing Lou Lombardo, and then we'll have a little other engagement where we'll reach out to you, the audience, and those of you who are watching this as a podcast, we'd ask you to respond as we're asking the audience to respond. That may sound confusing, but hopefully it won't be when we get into it. So this is about stories. And we thought the best way would be to hear a story. And we're looking at the tension between stories of humiliation and stories of dignity, and how can we transform one to the other. So I'm going to ask Lou to recount a story that he has heard that affected him.
Yeah, in my classes on violence in the world of children for about 30 years, we've been asking questions about students to respond to examples, provide examples where they felt in their childhood. So these are adults now reflecting on their childhood, whether human dignity was supported by an adult or where it was violated by an adult, and how they felt about those violations or supports. And one story is of a woman who at the time was, I think, about 48 years old. And the experience happened when she was 8 years old. Her family used to go to a river in the summertime to relax. And the young girl, when she was 8 years old, was afraid of the water. She didn't like to go in the water, she didn't like to go in a boat in the water, and her mother was a tyrant on that issue. She kept pressuring the woman, the young student at the time, the 8-year-old. You got to go in, you're a bad person, what's wrong with you, can't you do anything right? I mean, she just belittled her forever. A couple times she actually threw her in the water and just terrified the young girl, and she just hated it. The next summer, that was the violation of her human dignity.
So now we're going to interrupt for a moment. So that's the story of humiliation. And Amy's going to ask you a question or two.
So am I supposed to do this? Thanks. So having heard this story and the way that this young girl was regarded by her mother and treated by her mother, we'd love to hear some words, you can just call them out, of how that impacts you, what emotions are coming up for you when you hear about this story of humiliation. So you can just call it out and I'll repeat it so we have it on the recording. Cringing. Shame. Anger. Fear.
Want to give her a hug.
Compassion, want to give her a hug. Empathy. Sad.
Resonance with my stories.
So resonance with your own stories. Betrayal. Thank you.
Now the second hip.
I'm sorry, one more. I just wanted to say, just notice the power. That was a brief story. None of us are 8 years old anymore, as near as I can tell, and yet reflect on all of the emotional recognition that it inspired. Different range, but all of it was negative and humiliating.
My heartbeat went up 8 beats a minute. I just looked at my Fitbit, listening to that story.
Wonderful. So, Lou, can you tell us what happened the next summer?
The next summer, her grandfather comes to the river to stay with them. And the grandfather is a nice guy, and he wanted to take her out in the boat and take her into the water. And she told him, says, "Grandpa, I'm afraid. It scares me." And he sat down and asked her, "Well, why do you feel that way? What's going on?" She didn't understand. She didn't know. But she just said, it's something that scares me, and I know Mom wants me to go, and she yells at me and all this. She said, well, don't worry, it'll be all right. We'll do it when you're ready. And they talked again, and he asked her, are you ready? Do you want to go out? And finally she got the courage because he was listening to her. He recognized what she was experiencing. And he said, okay, come with me. And they went down to the boat, got in the boat, took her a while to get in. She sat down, he rocked the boat a little bit, just now don't be afraid to see how it feels, try it out, get used to it. And they started going out. Then he says, put your hand on this little tiller here, and I'll make the boat go forward and you can steer it. See how it moves. And he put his hand on top of hers and helped her steer the boat. And then she wasn't afraid. She said that was the most powerful experience she ever had in her life, of being recognized, of being listened to, and being a person. So that was her example of human dignity.
Thank you, Lou.
So having heard this story of human dignity, what emotions or what responses are happening in you now?
Tears.
Tears.
And my heartbeat went back the 8 points.
And your heartbeat restored to where it was before
Exactly where it was when
the humiliation
we started the
story.
Yeah, it's amazing. Very Claudia.
Joy,
Healing.
healing,
Gratitude.
gratitude. Thank you.
So we want to promote the power of stories, and we also want to ask you to reflect on how a story of humiliation can be replaced by or offset by a story of dignity. We asked ourselves, why are stories so powerful? And we felt that there's power in stories in at least 3 ways. One is the power of telling the story. A member of our group told a story that was very painful and reported that there was some power in being able to tell that story. The power of listening, what happened to us in the group, the empathy that was triggered the way it has been for you in listening to Lou's story and several other stories. And then the power, I'm sorry, I missed, I thought it went in the other order. The power of being heard, right? There's the speaking, the story itself, there's the listening, and then what does it feel like when someone, as I think Evelyn said earlier, listens you into voice. So the power comes from those places. We also talked about how listening can deepen the sense of empathy and kind of an understanding of the experience, almost as if it happened to you, apropos of Michael's heart rate going up and down. And it can be healing to the listener, right? Maybe it connects to a path in your own life that you can imagine how it might have been different if your grandmother had only, or if your neighbor had said, etc. And the last point I think we want to leave you with is the power of stories to humanize and to move through defenses. I tell a story of when I used to work at Bell Labs with engineers and trying to persuade them that there was sexism and racism in the organization. And I said that because I heard it from the people I interviewed as an organizational consultant. And when we used a survey and there were numbers, they would say, well, what was the standard deviation? Well, wait a minute. If you asked the question this way, I think you would have gotten a different answer. When I read them verbatims, what a woman said, I feel humiliated when I go to a meeting and none of the guys talk to me, or I say something and you know the story. I say something, no one says anything, someone else says something, and people say it's a great idea. So hearing those stories, all of a sudden the defenses were penetrated, I think is the word we wanted to use. And so there's a lot more to understand about stories, but I think I feel even more invigorated about how stories can play a role in healing and restoring dignity. So
Could I
thank
add
you.
just one thing?
Yeah, and Lou's going to add the...
And if you would like to contribute your stories, we have on the Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies website a call for stories that you could send to me at childhumandignity@gmail.com. So you can write your own stories about support for human dignity or violations for human dignity, and both, really. And we're hoping to put together a collection of those stories to make childhood and human dignity a real centerpiece of the work that goes on.
And I'd like to extend that to say stories not only about childhood, and I'll catch those. All right, thank you.
Very good.